Hi, Sarah.
Hi, Alison. So I've decided that we're going to outsource the start of this episode.
Interesting. So you don't like my intros?
Oh, don't take it that way. No. I use ChatGPT, right? This is this chatbot that interacts in a very conversational way and generates surprisingly comprehensive text. So I asked it for an introduction to a podcast segment about the use of ChatGPT by students in France and the rising concern from schools and university. And then I put the answer in a text-to-speech generator, and here's what we got.
Hello and welcome to this segment of our podcast where we'll be discussing the increasing use of ChatGPT by students in France and the growing concerns of schools and universities. In recent years, ChatGPT has become a popular tool among students in France as a quick and convenient way to access information and complete assignments. However, with this rise in usage, schools and universities are starting to raise concerns about the impact of relying on AI technology on critical thinking and academic integrity. In this segment, we'll be exploring these concerns and the steps that schools and universities are taking to address them. So stay tuned as we delve into the topic of ChatGPT and its role in education in France.
Oh, Lordy. Well, I guess I can just pack my bags and go home then.
Yeah, it's not bad, right? I mean, it came up with these issues of academic integrity and critical thinking, which I did not feed it. But it's pretty dull, isn't it? I mean, the robot voice doesn't really help, but it's not the most thrilling intro.
No. I think you're right. It's definitely not riveting. It's not doing anything for me. But then, well, not all podcasts can be riveting. Maybe all the time. Let's be honest.
Ouch.
They're not noble literature, are they?
Yeah. Although we try. But students are banking on this sort of blandness, and they've started using the chatbot in school. I mean, for some of them, it gets them off the hook for their homework assignments. Other students are actually using it more deeply.
Je lui ai expliqué ce que j'étais en train de faire, donc une revue de littérature sur tel sujet.
So that's a business student, Theo, who used ChatGPT to help write his master's thesis. He obviously doesn't want to be identified, and he asked the chatbot to do a literature review, lay out the structure of the thesis, and then write up the methodology.
À partir de ça, il m'a rédigé un plan très crédible. Alors maintenant,
It came up with a very credible structure, he said, though he didn't use everything the machine wrote. He had done his reading, so he rewrote parts that didn't make sense, but he says it gave good ideas that he used in the thesis. Plus, this is not an isolated case, he says. Some of his friends have used ChatGPT even more, taking all of what it generated without question.
Well, that's the worrying part, isn't it? They're not having to think.
Yeah.
And it also means students are not learning how to do their own research.
Exactly. And of course, trying to figure out who uses it and how they use it is worrying. A lot of teachers and professors are trying to say, which of my students is just a bad writer and which has used the computer. Sciences Po, just last week, became the first French university, actually one of the first in the world, to ban the use of ChatGPT and other AI text generators. So they say using them without citing them is cheating.
But will a ban, in fact, solve the problem?
I mean, probably not, right? AI isn't going away. Computers have already been used, for example, in the news business, writing short articles, even reading newscasts.
Yeah, I've seen that in Japan, for example. I guess our jobs are on the line, let's be honest.
Yeah, a lot is on the line. And it's going to get worse, or better, depending on your perspective. The technology is evolving very quickly. Computation power allows these machines to learn using a massive amount of data generated by humans, to be fair. It's using all the books and all the stuff on the internet. And this is called the deep learning. This is what we hear, one of those catchphrases. Last summer, Jean-Gabriel Ganassia, who's a computer science professor at the Sorbonne University, used a text generator, not ChatGPT, to write part of a column that he writes on the ethics of research for the monthly popular science magazine La Recherche.
I find it really impressive. I was a little bit, I cannot say frightened, but I was surprised by the quality of the text. I asked a very simple question. Automatic text generation, plagiarism of ideas, and scientific integrity.
So that was your prompt to the machine?
Just this, yeah. And I was very impressed. I had a 2-page paper. I translated it in French using DeepL, and it was well-structured, with sentences which were correctly built, with a lexicon which was quite broad. There were some oddities, something which were okay, but
It passed your test.
in a way, yes. It looked like bad Wikipedia, so you have very general sentence. But there were something which was, I think, interesting because they mentioned what they call paper mills. And they discuss the role of this paper mill in scientific production.
What is a paper mill?
Yes, a paper mill is a machine which is able to build scientific papers that scientists, which are not very honest, send to journal and hope to be accepted.
And so the machine picked up on this while it was looking through, I guess, doing its research, and picked up on this phenomenon.
Yes, and this is the reason why I submit this seeds to the machine, because I wanted to see what it was able to generate. And I was very impressed. Even I didn't really agree with the text because they say, oh yes, this is plagiarism. And it's an open question, because the text generation is not exactly what we have in mind when we mention plagiarism. Plagiarism, in a way, is a robbery. You steal a person and you appropriate what he wrote on your name. And here, you just reuse the words of all the population. And this is exactly what we all do. So we cannot say exactly it's plagiarism. So it's difficult to characterize the type of infraction or the type of problem you have with this.
Well, I actually think it's really interesting because reading the text, having read what you made the machine wrote, it was very flat. Like you said, it's sort of bad Wikipedia. It's very flat, and there's very little. Like it says, yes, paper mills exist, and they submit, their papers to journals. But it didn't give us any examples. It didn't cite anything. So, like as you said, this idea of plagiarism, it's hard to see where it's plagiarizing from. How does this play into how it's being used in academia or in research settings?
So, concerning education, when you write the text, I'm afraid to say that it's better than some of my students, not all, fortunately. It's not very good, but not very bad. And
so when it's being used in a college setting, as a professor or teacher, you might not notice.
No, maybe, and you say, okay, he's not very original, maybe there are some problem with the reference, but it's quite correct.
So have any of your students ever used any of these tools to submit papers to you?
Not yet. So I have to say that I'm professor of computer science. So what we want our students write is maybe solve a problem, and so the wording is not so important. The problem is that when you teach, you train them, and when you ask them to write a paper or something, is to help them to train and understand what are the difficulties. So if they use this kind of tools, even if they have an average mark, the problem is, okay, they will not be trained. So it's, in a way, it's a failure of our education system.
In what sense? What do you mean as a failure of the education system?
The fact that some students want to use this kind of thing to write their text. Yeah.
In a sense, what? Because they're too focused in on the grade and not thinking in terms of learning for learning's sake?
Yes, exactly. We know that it's so important today for them to have the exam, but in a way, a good education is based not on the diploma, but on what they learn. And the problem, if they use these kind of techniques, they will not learn and they will not be able in the future to write a text. But I think the problem is more for the professor, because if you feel that you were abused by the student, it makes you really uncomfortable. I think this is more the problem of professors than the problem of students.
So worse for teachers than for students, he says.
Yeah, because one of the big issues, of course, is going to be testing and evaluating your students.
Yeah, and we know France loves exams, tests. My kids get one virtually every week.
Yeah. I mean, and it is the bedrock of a lot of education systems. I talked about this with Thierry de Villiers, who's the founder of a startup, Evidence B, that's come up with modules for students, for elementary and high school students, to learn vocabulary and math. The modules use cognitive psychology ideas, but also AI tools to personalize them, specifically for students who are struggling. The Education Ministry has actually recently provided access to the math module for all primary schools in the country. So that's something. We talked about the use of AI in education. He is, of course, enthusiastic about it. But he says it will require teachers rethinking their approach to teaching and testing.
when you evaluate something and the format of your evaluation can be provided by a good paper written by ChatGPT, your evaluation doesn't work anymore. We call it cheat GPT.
What you're describing, though, seems to be like the basis of a lot of what the French education system is based on. Research this subject, write an essay, construct some thoughts, and hand in a paper. And you're saying these tools are actually going to force a re-examination of how we do things.
So we have the baccalaureate in France. It's the symbolic evaluation.
This is the big exam that you do at the end of high school,
Exactly.
where you have oral exams and written exams to make sure you learned everything in the last 12 years.
Exactly. But more and more, it's been several years now that we have a kind of constant evaluation, and the baccalaureate is not anymore the key timing for your higher education. So this evaluation on the fly is more and more going into the French education system. So this is one kind of answer. The other one, it's we have been all over the world seen the mass effect of the calculators. And when the calculators came, just like ChatGPT, they say, okay, if you don't do anymore the addition, the subtraction, it will ruin the mass learning. So there are still people that say that there is an impact of having this calculator. But those tools that empower the capacity of finding knowledge for students, of course, will push teacher or academy and exam to change the way that they do the evaluation, but it will accommodate easily, I feel.
Well, that's interesting that you say, because, France has a very centralized education system. It's top down. Do you think that as it's constructed today, the education system will be able to welcome these tools in a way that will be effective for students?
It's a very centralized system. You're right. There is a Ministry of Education, then you have academy, inspector, and then the teacher. But the strongest thing that we have in the French education system, and we have union also to protect that, is the pedagogical freedom of the teacher. Every teacher has the ability to decide the way he will teach, the way he wants to use this tool or not, and that. You have a national curriculum. This is very top-down. But within this national curriculum, the pedagogy, which is the key of a teacher, it's a freedom. And there is a lot of group going on now, actually, in France about ChatGPT, how you can use that to make ChatGPT provide an answer and to check what is right, what is wrong, what are the sources, why there is bias in the sources of ChatGPT. And it's a way to construct a better knowledge. So I see the teacher taking these tools to increase the capacity of students of being critical thinker. So that's the way teacher will behave. Some will forbid that and some will use it.
So you're saying, though, then, teachers have a huge amount of freedom to deal with this and incorporate these tools or not.
Yeah.
Then obviously you're in the business of trying to encourage them to use certain tools and to be creative and think outside the box. But how do you see the sort of culture of teachers and the way teachers are taught in their openness to technology like this and to, rethinking how they have been evaluating students and interacting with students?
Yeah, I launched a startup on EdTech, so I have to be on the optimist side of the using of ICT. Obviously, also COVID, we stopped every education system all over the world, even in France, help teachers to progress in the confidence and in the use of this kind of tool. So you have the early adopters, you have the one that like to test this kind of new tool, you have those that don't want any digital tool in the. All are good, I would say. What is good is if a teacher is confident with the tool they use. It have not to be a general fear or general obligation.
Well, clearly he has a vested interest in promoting these kind of tools. I must say, for the moment, I'm a little bit skeptical.
Yeah.
Especially with younger kids, the idea that they're going to get their hands on these tools when they haven't even learned to be critical yet. We'll see.
Quand on pouvait, bon an, mal an, partir à l'âge de 60 ans, à la retraite, on mettait son plus beau costard pour faire honneur au pot de départ où l'on nous offrait par égard une épuisette.
So a song there about retiring at 60.
At 60.
Yeah, pension. All this talk of pensions is rife in France at the moment, Sarah.
Yeah. The government's pushing a reform to raise the minimum retirement age from 62, actually, to 64. And it's not going over well. It's being debated hotly in Parliament. and it's drawn millions of protesters out into the streets.
The current system, where people in work pay for the pensions of current retirees, was founded in 1945 at the end of World War II. But the very first pensions go much further back than that, Sarah, to the 17th century and Louis XIV.
Oh, wow, the Sun King.
Yeah, and he shone his light, first of all, on the Navy and then ballet dancers. He signed the first edict on the 22nd of September, 1673, so 450 years ago, in Nancy.
So why those two professions? I mean, these seems like random groups of people, the Navy and ballet dancers.
Yeah. Well, it was the brainchild of Jean-Baptiste Colbert.
Louis XIV's finance minister.
Yeah, but also Secretary General of the Royal Navy. Now, at the time, France was fighting in what's known as the Franco-Dutch War, which began in 1672. It was trying to get possession of the Spanish Netherlands, fighting in particular against the British and the Spanish, both of which had very strong navies. So France needed to be able to shore up its prowess on the seas, but it was struggling to recruit sailors, or at least good ones. At the time, it relied a lot on so-called press gangs, and at its worst, this involved men being plied with alcohol in inns, then getting bashed over the head, and waking up to find themselves in irons on a warship.
Ugh, so more or less enforced enrollment. Probably not the best way to get the most motivated or disciplined people involved.
Yeah, and Colbert understood that. He saw that the system wasn't working and that the Navy needed to make itself a bit more attractive. So he came up with this system where the Marines were enrolled by age, and to encourage them to do this, he offered them perks, including an invalidity pension in case you got injured.
Yeah, which probably happened frequently in wars.
Yeah, and in the 1673 edict then, he introduced a Caisse des Invalides de la Marine Royale, a fund for Royal Navy invalids. The sailors themselves made a small contribution, about 2.5% of their wages, and it was used to fund the construction and upkeep of two big hospitals, one in Rochefort on the west coast and the other in Toulon in the south. The one in Rochefort, by the way, was finally inaugurated much later in 1788 and also ended up receiving widows and orphans of sailors.
All right, so this was for the injured, but how did it turn into an old age pension?
Well, back in the 17th century, and indeed for a long time afterwards, people continued working until they literally dropped.
So retirement was pretty much the same as getting injured and invalidity.
Yeah, exactly. And it was very tough, of course, for people who didn't have savings or family to help them. So Colbert's system gave the Marines a kind of security net for their old age. And it still exists. It's known as the Établissement National des Invalides de la Marine, the National Establishment of Navy Invalids. It's a special regime with a fund for healthcare and another one for pensions.
So one of these special regimes, is it under threat? I mean, part of the idea of reforming the pension system right now is to do away with these special regimes. There are 42 of them, often set up for people working physically demanding jobs.
No, in fact, it's not under threat. For whatever reason, the Marine pension is not on the chopping board. I guess that's good for them.
Okay, so that's the Marines. Now, what about the ballet dancers?
Louis XIV was a big ballet fan, it turns out. He performed for the first time in public, aged 12, and throughout his reign he did a lot to promote dancing. In 1698, so 25 years after the Navy, he signed an edict setting up a pension system for the dancers of the Paris Opera. It introduced a retirement age of 40, and that remained in place right up until 2010, when then President Nicolas Sarkozy raised it to 42. And under the current proposed pension reform, the 154 dancers of the Paris Opera Ballet Corps also get to keep their special regime. So, Sarah, this current pension reform has brought, as we've said, many people out onto the streets.
Yeah. The first two demos drew over 2 million people across France, and more protests are being planned.
And if you want to get your message across during these protests and get, of course, the attention of the media, then you need a good, clear sign with a clever slogan.
Yeah.
And here in France, on any demo worth its salt, you'll see a very tall man with his arms outstretched in a V shape holding up a very big sign with a catchy slogan written in big capital letters in 4 primary colours.
I've seen that guy, yeah. And this photo gets picked up by a lot of agency photographers and often becomes the photo used by newspapers on their front pages covering these demos.
Yeah, because his placards are so distinctive. I recently spotted one of them on a rally in London demanding better pay for NHS nurses.
In London?
Yeah, exactly. So it got me thinking, crikey, this guy is a phenomenon. Who is he? So I wanted to find out a bit more about Placard Man, as the French press have dubbed him. His name is Jean-Baptiste Rédé, and he goes by the name of Voltuan, which makes you think of Volts and...
Or Voltron.
Yeah. He's a retired primary school teacher, and he lives rather modestly in Burgundy, and he's become a full-time activist. He's also a poet. So he's been on... all the marches for climate justice, social justice, women's rights, animal rights. He's a vegetarian, peace demos, you name it, he's there at the front carrying his placard. The one that launched him was Écoutez la colère du peuple, listen to the people's rage, which he brandished in 2010 during, guess what? Pension reform protests. Yeah. And he's still very mobilised on that issue today. I caught up with him just before the 31st of January demo in a Parisian cafe, because that's where he draws his famous placards.
I decided to commit full time for social rights, ecology, peace, and real democracy. That's my life. I have been revolted since childhood, because in my family it was not all that happy at all. No family in harmony.
Not much affection.
Not at all. So I got affection with nature and animals first. That was my first family. Mm-hmm. And then my second family was when I was 20 years old. I commit also for social rights and peace and so on. I have always been revolting.
So Jean-Baptiste, one of your very famous placards is Écoutez le peuple en colère, listen to people.
Yes, to the people's rage, yes.
So you've really become well known and very visible through these very distinctive placards which you hold up above your head.
Like a shout. I'm shouting, it's a cry. It's a cry, always a cry for a better world.
A word about the graphic art, because this is what gets photographed and this is what sometimes gets sent around the world.
I chose to write in big capital letters with the main colors, basic colors, black, red, blue and green. And a few years later I put another one, yellow. Because it is like a flash. When you see my signs on photo, it is very flashy. So it's good. And the big letters, it's an advantage because in the demonstrations, people can see the message from far.
And it's also because you are very tall, 1 meter 92, so everybody can see these placards from afar. So the latest one that you've just done to go on the demonstration against pension reform, what does it say?
It says that Macron and Borne, the president and the prime minister, have to resign and to stop their pension reform.
It's a play on words, because you say Macron-Borne doivent battre en retraite, which means they have to withdraw, literally, but also withdraw the pension reform. So it's clever.
Yes. It's a friend of mine which gave me the idea. In general, I found my ideas myself, because I think it over a long time before the demonstration. I come back to it, even by night. Sometimes I think over new message. And yes, there is another side, always. Two messages, always important, the two.
So turning around the big placard here. How big is it? It's always the same size?
Always. 1 meter large and 1 meter 40 centimeters long. Always.
And so here on the back, we've got a photograph
of Bernard Arnault, one of the richest men in the world.
So he's the head of LVMH.
He is Louis Vuitton, Moet NC, etc.
So champagne, luxury goods.
Yes, luxury goods. The problem with Mr. Bernard Arnault is that he has been using tax haven for years and years. He put his billions in 6 tax havens. 6. When you say there is no money to pay pensions, to help the disabled, to help the poor, and to invest in ecological transition, which is urgent, We have plenty of money. But all this money is in majority in tax havens. So in Bahamas, in the city, in Delaware, in Guernsey, in Monaco, Luxembourg, Liechtenstein, and so on, so on, so on, so on. So that's totally unfair, totally unbearable.
Of course, the European Union is taking measures to clamp down on tax havens.
Not enough. They have decided few percent of tax on people like Bernard Arnault, but that's largely insufficient.
Do you have any idea how many demonstrations you've taken part in the last 10 years?
No.
I mean, hundreds?
My answer is, when you fight, it is the same. When you love, you don't count what you do. You don't count. You go. I like to quote Albert Camus, who said, you don't have only to notice the injustice in the world, you have to give your life for it. That's wonderful. I love him. We have always to fight for a better world, but we have to fight pacifically, but with much motivation.
You're retired now.
Yes.
So how do you live? And how do you finance all of this? Because you don't live in Paris, so you travel up from Burgundy?
Yes, I take the train or BlaBlaCar. My pension is not at the top, but I have somehow enough to make a living because I don't have children, I don't have a TV, I don't have a car, I don't keep money in my bank.
You don't have any savings?
I have no property of my own.
All your money goes into protesting?
And in poetry, because I have written a lot of poems who I signed in bookshops in Paris and in Provence, in France.
Jean-Baptiste, sometimes the demonstrations, especially in Paris, have turned violent. Have you ever been caught up in anything unpleasant, any of the violence?
Well, yes, one time in 1995. It was also demonstrations against the pension reform of Alain Juppé. He was Prime Minister. France was blocked during nearly 1 month. And I was caught with other people in the University of Jussieu, and I spent the night in custody. But that's a long time ago.
If things start turning a bit violent, do you always move away? What happens?
I am cautious. In demonstrations, we have to take care of other people, not to walk on people's feet, not to fall down. So I am very cautious because as my sign is big, I've never had an accident with it because I am always holding it hard and it's important to look everywhere, what is happening. In the demonstrations, I like to notice other people's signs. Because when you revolt, you are very creative. When you revolt, as said Bob Marley, you get up, you stand up, fight for your rights. That's important. So he's also in my pantheon of people I love. I have also organized myself mobilizations in Paris for Syrian refugees and Uyghurs. I have organized march to end pesticides, and we were received in the Ministry of Ecology. So what is wonderful in mobilization is that you always meet good people. I met many people who are well-known and people who are not that well-known, but for me there are no hierarchy. I don't feel superior to a butterfly. That's my philosophy of life.
You say there's a sort of community almost when you're out demonstrating, and most people are good. Yeah. But have you sometimes encountered a little bit of resistance? I mean, some people might have said, he's always at the front. Maybe you're drawing a little bit too much attention to yourself.
It is a minority who say that. Because most people, they come to me with a smile and say, oh, go on, I love your sign. It's wonderful, you're always here. But I answer them back immediately. You also, you fight and you are engaged. You say you see me everywhere because you are everywhere. So I give back as a compliment.
What will make you stop one day?
I often tell a joke about it. I said every joke there is something true inside. Is that when I will pass over this life to begin others, when I will be lying in the earth, I will have a double fond.
A false bottom.
Yes, to go on demonstrations.
So a false bottom, a trapdoor, right, in his coffin. That's quite an image.
Yeah, so he can get out, as he said, day and night at any moment. But, talking of images, I noticed that on the Paris demo, a couple of signs, they were like mini versions of his work, using the same capital letters, the same 4 colors. The slogans, of course, were nowhere near as punchy, and the holders were not going the extra effort of holding them above their heads, so they were far less visible. But as they say, imitation is the sincerest form of flattery.
La réforme du code du travail, on veut mieux que ça. C'est pas qu'il y ait 2 ou 3 failles, on veut mieux que ça. Se résigner sans livre de bataille, qu'ils disent que l'on les bataille, que les gens acceptent qu'on les assaille.
So we've come to the end of the show. Spotlight on France is a production of Radio France International. This episode was mixed by Cécile Pompiani.
Do you have any questions or comments? Please get in touch. We'd love to hear from you. You can send an email to spotlight.france@rfi.fr. You can also find us on Instagram, Spotlight on France.
And you can get previous episodes at rfienglish.com or wherever you get your podcasts. We'll be back on the 9th of March. Bye for now, Sarah.
Bye, Alison.
Les heures supplémentaires peuvent être 5 fois moins majorées. Les apprentis mineurs peuvent trimer 10 heures par journée. Les heures partielles à 24 heures, la semaine à 35 heures. Et d'autres activités à cœur que cette loi vise à chourer. C'est au service des exploiteurs, des groupes les plus dévastateurs. À qui cette loi fait des faveurs que l'État a couré. Le plafonnement des indemnités, on peut pas se bourrer. C'est pas pour aider le salarié car on veut mieux que ça. On veut mieux que ça. On veut mieux que ça.